The sun was a scorched coin in the sky above Black Mesa, where the wind whispered through mesquite and bleached cattle bones. On a ridge above his dying ranch, Boone Carver, once a respected rancher and Civil War scout, stood with a shovel in hand, sweat streaking the dirt on his worn face. He was 56, skin leathered from decades of sun, eyes pale blue like a dry riverbed. And today, Boone wasn't digging for water. He was digging his own grave. The land had turned against him. Drought, cattle rustlers, debt collectors from Abilene, and worst of all Clara, his wife of 22 years, had been declared dead 3 winters ago after a stagecoach robbery near El Paso. The coach had been found overturned, passengers slaughtered, her brooch recovered. In a pool of blood, Boone had buried that brooch beneath the cottonwood tree they were married under. Now, the ranch was empty, no cattle, no hands, no hope. Boone figured he'd go out his own way quietly, on his land, with his boots on and the sunset behind him. He stabbed the shovel into the earth again, the soil dry and stubborn. His breath came slow, lungs tired from years of hard riding and harder loss. The breeze tugged at his collar, and a crow cried out from a distant fence post. And then a silence. He paused. Bootsteps. Not heavy like a man's, lighter, deliberate. He turned slowly, expecting coyotes or perhaps the wind playing tricks on his old mind. Instead, there at the top of the ridge stood a woman. Her dress was torn at the hem, dusty from long travel. A shawl clung to her shoulders, and around her neck glinted a familiar gold locket, the very one Boone had given Clara. The day she first rode onto the ranch, his shovel slipped from his hand. The woman's lips trembled. Boone. He staggered backward, nearly falling into the half-dug grave. His voice barely escaped him. Clara, she nodded, eyes filling with tears. I came home. The wind stopped. The world stood still. And Boone Carver, who hadn't cried since his mother died, fell to his knees in disbelief. Boone didn't remember how long he sat there, knees buried in the dirt, mouth parted like a man seeing an angel or a ghost. The dry wind tugged at his coat as Clara stepped closer, each footfall stirring dust from the parched earth. She stood before him now, the same height, the same storm-gray eyes. Her hair was streaked with more silver than he remembered, and her skin bore faint scars and sun-darkened lines. But there was no mistake, this was his Clara. Boone rose slowly, like a bear from hibernation, unsure if he was dreaming or if death had already taken him. Clara, he whispered again, voice trembling. It's me, Boone, I swear it. He reached out as if touching a mirage, but her hand was real warm, worn, and calloused. Her thumb traced the lines of his palm, and she smiled through tears. Boone choked. But the stagecoach, the sheriff said your brooch. I know, she said gently. They left it to make you think I was dead. I tried to get back. To you, Lord knows I tried. His world spun. He stumbled back against the half-dug grave. Start from the beginning. Clara sat down on a fallen fence rail nearby. Her eyes wandered across the land, this dead, broken land that was once there. Kingdom. That day on the stagecoach, we were ambushed just after sundown pass. Outlaws. Not just for robbery, they were trafficking women south, across the border. I fought, killed one of them with my hate pin, but I got knocked out. Boone clenched his fists when I came to. She continued, I was already in Mexico. They moved us from town to town, me and 3 other women. We were sold, branded like cattle. I never thought I'd see this side of the Rio Grande again. Boone's face darkened with rage, veins pulsing in his neck. I'll kill them all. I already got 2 of them, Clara said, eyes like flint. The rest scattered after a Yavapai tracker helped us escape. Took years. I was weak, sick, but I kept your locket. I kept the memory of this place you burned in my mind. Boone dropped to his knees again, Not from grief this time, but from the weight of it all their years apart, the hell she'd endured, the grave he'd nearly climbed into without knowing the truth. I was gonna bury myself today, he confessed, voice hollow. Didn't see no reason to go on. I know, she said softly. I could feel it when I got near. I saw the grave before I saw you. My heart dropped. She looked him over, eyes sad. You've wasted away. Boone chuckled bitterly. You were my reason, Clara. Once I lost you, the land didn't matter. The cattle didn't matter. I was just waiting to stop breathing. She reached forward and cradled his face in her hands. You're breathing now, and I'm here, and I'm not letting you go again. The silence stretched between them, full of heartbreak and grit and unspoken memories. The sun dipped lower, turning the sky into a bleeding canvas of reds and purples. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried. Come on, Clara said finally, rising and dusting off her skirt. Let's go inside. I could use some coffee. If that old stove still works. Boone blinked. You're staying. She turned back, smiling. I came home, Boone. I aim to stay and fix what's left. He picked up the shovel and stared at the half-dug grave. Then he slammed it into the earth not to finish digging, but to fill it back in. The old ranch house hadn't changed much. The paint had long since peeled. The porch sagged like a tired back, and the front door groaned like a spirit when Boone pushed it open. Dust danced in the fading light as Clara stepped inside, eyes scanning the place she once called home. She ran her hand across the table Boone had built himself. Her fingers found the groove in the wood where she'd once spilled lamp oil during a storm. It was still there, a scar in the grain. Boone stood behind her, uncertain, almost afraid to believe she was real. I tried to keep it like you left. It, he said quietly, didn't have much reason to change things. Clara turned and smiled. You did fine, Boone. He said about stoking the stove while Clara moved through the house slowly, like she was walking through a memory. The coffee was weak and bitter, but when Boone handed her the chipped tin cup, she drank it like it was holy. They sat at the table as the fire in the stove crackled, casting flickers across the walls. I still don't understand, Boone said. How'd you make it back all this way? What happened after Mexico? Clara leaned back, sighing deep. After we escaped, we were taken in by a Yavapai village. They'd seen what those men had done to women like me before. Their medicine. Woman nursed me back. I stayed there for nearly 2 years, Boone. They taught me how to ride bareback, how to trap coyotes, how to speak their language. They gave me a second name, City, the bird who returns. Boone's eyes moistened. Why didn't you send word? I tried. God knows I tried. Sent letters with travelers, with army patrols, but none came back. And I didn't dare come north until I was strong enough to fight if someone tried to take me again. Boone reached across the table, rough hands trembling. He laid them over hers. You've always been strong, Clara. Stronger than me. She smiled faintly. Maybe. But I've carried the weight of your grief, even from far away, like a rope tied between our hearts. He nodded, unable to speak. After a while, Clara stood. I want to see the barn. Boone followed her out under the moonlight. The barn was half collapsed, its roof slanted and its beams rotting. Coyotes had made a den near the back. A single rusted horseshoe still hung above the entrance. Clara stood in silence, the wind tugging her shawl. We lost so much, Boone nodded. We did. She turned to him, fire suddenly flashing in her eyes. But we ain't dead yet, are we? He blinked. What are you saying? I'm saying there's life in this land still. There's wood in the hills. There's grass in the valley come spring. We got to good hands between us and a whole lot of fight left. Boone stared at her like he was seeing her for the first time all over again. You really think we can bring it back? Clara stepped closer. I didn't walk all this way to watch you lay down and die, Boone Carver. I came back to rebuild, to live." A long silence passed between them before Boone finally broke into a slow, weary smile. "Then I reckon I better fix that busted fence before the snow comes." Clara grinned. "And I'll see what's left in that garden patch by sunrise." Together, under the stars, they stood side by side, staring at the broken barn and the wild land beyond it. And though it was ruined and empty and silent, it felt like home again. The morning light spilled gold over the ranch like honey on dry bread. The air was crisp, carrying the faint smell of mesquite and last night's fire. Boone woke to the sound of movement outside, not coyotes, not the whine but footsteps with purpose. He rose slowly, his bones stiff from years of hard riding and even harder sleeping. When he stepped onto the porch, he saw Clara kneeling in what used to be the garden plot, her sleeves rolled up, hands in the soil. Boone rubbed his eyes. "Ain't much grows in that dirt anymore." Clara didn't look up. "That's 'cause no one's been talkin' to it." "Talkin' to it." Boone chuckled. She smiled, not breaking her rhythm. "You stop talkin' to the land. It forgets your voice. You treat it like it's dead. It starts actin' that way." He watched her for a moment, then glanced at the old plow leaning against the shed, rusted and half-buried. Maybe she was right. Maybe the land was just waiting for someone to believe in it again. By noon, Boone had pulled out the old axe and started working on the fence posts along the north line. Clara came to him with fresh well water wrapped in a damp cloth to keep it cool. Her presence was like a fire that refused to go out, steady, warm, impossible to ignore. But their peace didn't last long. The first sign was a distant puff of dust, rising from the road like smoke. Then the sound of hooves. Boone narrowed his eyes. Riders. Clara stood beside him, eyes squinting. "They don't look like neighbors." 3 men on horseback came into view, rough-looking types with dust-covered vests, long rifles slung over their saddles, and ill intentions carved into their sneers. Boone stepped off the porch, hand drifting to the side of his coat. "Go inside." "Clara, I'm not hiding," she said firmly. He gave her a look, but it was the same fire in her eyes that had once made him fall in love with her back in Wichita, when she'd knocked out a drunk gambler with a frying pan. The riders slowed as they approached the gate, one of them spitting to the side before tipping his hat with a mock grin. "Well, now," the lead one said, "didn't expect to see anyone still living out here on this dust heap." Boone didn't flinch. "State your business." "Name's Slade. My boys and I been ridding this territory. Heard tell this place was abandoned. Figured we'd stake our claim." Boone's jaw tightened. "You figured wrong." Slade laughed, looking past him toward Clara. "That your woman? She looks like she's got some fight. I like that." Boone took one slow step forward. "You get back on them horses and ride out of here. Last warning." Slade sneered. "Or what, you'll shoot all 3 of us?" Boone didn't answer. Clara stepped down from the porch and walked up beside him. "He won't have to." Without breaking stride, she pulled Boone's old rifle from the rocker where he'd leaned it earlier that morning. She chambered around. With one fluid motion, the sound echoed. Slade's eyes went wide. Boone couldn't help the grin spreading on his face. "Told you she had fight." The men hesitated. One of them muttered, "Ain't worth it, Slade." "Let's go." Slade stared at Clara, then at Boone. After a tense beat, he spat in the dirt again. "You ain't worth the bullet, old man, but don't get too cozy. This land don't belong to nobody no more." "Then it's ours," Boone replied. "We're somebody." Slade turned his horse with a curse and galloped off, the others following. The dust settled. Clara lowered the rifle. Boone turned to her. "I think I just fell in love all over again." She smirked. "Told you, I didn't come home to hide." They stood together at the gate, watching the horizon. The land was rough. The future uncertain. But for the first time in years, Boone didn't feel alone. He felt alive. The days that followed the standoff were quiet, almost too quiet. Boone and Clara kept to their work, as if repairing the ranch would stitch their souls back together. Fences were rebuilt, the roof patched, and Clara's garden showed the first green sprouts in years. But trouble had a way of circling back like a buzzard. Boone knew men like Slade didn't forget being humiliated, and though the outlaw had ridden off, Boone felt his shadow stretching across the land like a storm cloud. One evening, as the sun began its slow descent behind the mesas, Boone stood at the edge of the old cattle trail with a spyglass in hand. He'd ridden out to check the lower fences, but found something that made his blood chill. Fresh hoofprints in the valley. Multiple horses. Heavy recent. He returned to the homestead just as Clara was lighting the lanterns. "Boone," she called, wiping her hands on her apron. "Company's been scouting the ridge," he said, hanging his hat. "Slad's men, maybe more this time." Clara's face tightened. "You think they'll come at night?" "No, men like that wait for sunrise. Like roaches, they like to watch." She nodded. "Then we'd prepare." That night, under the lantern light and the stars, they set to work. Clara packed ammo. Boone barricaded windows and checked the rifles. The old rifle tower on the north end of the barn, once used by Boone's father during the cattle wars, was cleaned out and stocked with a long-range repeater. By the time the moon was high, the ranch looked like a battered fortress. Boone sat on the porch sharpening his knife, while Clara rested beside him, sipping water from a tin cup. "You ever think we'd be doing this again?" she asked. Boone chuckled dryly. "Didn't think I'd be alive this week, let alone preparing to fight." She leaned into him, shoulder to shoulder. "We'll get through it. We've already survived worse." Boone stared out across the open land. "It's not the bullets I fear, Clara. It's losing you again." She took his hand. "You won't." Just before dawn, they heard it, the unmistakable rhythm of hooves, dozens of them, echoing from the low valley like distant thunder. Boone stood. Clara followed. Slade was back, and this time, he'd brought friends. Dust rose in the early light, as over a dozen riders came into view, armed and riding hard. Slade led the pack, his long coat flapping behind him, rifle across his lap. The men behind him wore bandanas, long knives, and the look of jackals who smelled blood. Boone stepped out from the porch, his rifle resting across his arms. "Thought I warned you," he called, voice calm. Slade stopped at the gate, sneering. "You did. And I took that real personal, old man. So this time, I brought enough fire to take your whole little ghost ranch with me." Clara appeared at the doorway behind Boone, rifle in hand. "You still talk too much," Slade laughed, nodding to his men. "She's got spirit. Shame she'll be gone by noon." Boone stepped forward. "One last chance. Turn around and ride out. You try to take this land by force, it'll cost you." Slade spit and raised his hand. His men tensed, but before he could drop it, a high whistle pierced the air. Every head turned. From the far hills behind Boone's ranch, a line of riders appeared, slow and steady. Not outlaws, not rustlers. These men rode like soldiers. At their lead was a tall, weary native man with long black braids and a feathered band. Behind him were 6 more Yavapai warriors, each armed with bow, lance, or rifle. Clara smiled. "I told you I made friends." Slad's smirk faltered. Boone, still staring at the riders, raised an eyebrow. "You invited backup." Clara grinned. "Didn't think you'd mind." As the Yavapai warriors formed a line behind Boone's fence, Slad's men looked at one another, uncertain now. Boone stepped forward again, cocking his rifle. "Now it's your last chance." Slade cursed under his breath and turned his horse. "This ain't over. Carver, then come back with your coffin, Boone muttered. Slade and his men rode off in a cloud of dust. Boone exhaled. Clara leaned in. Told you we'd get through it. Boone took her hand. Together, they watched the sunrise pour light over the land, burnt, broken, but still theirs. The land was still, the kind of still that follows a storm or a gunfight. Boone sat on the porch sharpening a fence rail, while Clara knelt nearby, trimming back overgrown sagebrush along the walkway. The Yavapai warriors had left just after noon, with silent nods and steady gazes, no fanfare, no farewells. But Boone and Clara knew what they'd done. They'd stood as a wall between the past and the future. The Carver ranch had been spared for now. Clara wiped sweat from her brow and glanced at the sprouting green in the garden bed. Those beans are standing straighter today. Boone looked over and nodded. So's the house, indeed. The walls no longer sagged like broken shoulders. Clara had whitewashed the front boards that morning. The shutters hung even. Even the windmill creaked less when it turned, as if the land itself was breathing again. Still, Boone knew peace in the West was a fleeting thing. As if echoing that thought, Clara asked, "You think Slad's really gone? For good?" Boone took a long pause. "No, men like that don't disappear. They wait for you to get soft." Clara sat beside him, arms crossed over her apron. "Then we won't get soft." They both chuckled, but there was an edge of truth beneath the laughter. That night, Boone brought out a crate he hadn't opened in years. Inside were old blueprints, hand-sketched plans for a new barn, a smokehouse, even a schoolhouse Clara had once dreamed of. He laid them on the table. Clara ran her fingers over the brittle paper. "You kept these." "I couldn't throw 'em away," Boone said. "Not even when the barn burned. I just didn't have the heart to look at them without you." Clara smiled gently. "Well, you've got me now." They began working from sunup to sundown. Boone felled pines from the nearby grove while Clara cleaned out the chicken coop and reinforced the well. A traveling preacher passed through, offered a prayer, and traded nails for fresh eggs. Boone grumbled at first, but Clara said, "Even God can use a hammer." Weeks passed, then months. Snow dusted the mesa ridges, and the nights turned cold. But the ranch was alive again. Boone even began cutting timber for a new barn with a wide loft for the horses. "We don't have yet," he joked. One evening, as frost kissed the porch steps, Clara came to Boone holding something he hadn't seen in years, a faded photograph of the two of them on their wedding day. Her dress was simple, and his suit didn't quite fit, but the love on their faces was unmistakable. "I found it behind the hearth," she said. Boone stared at the photo, emotions brimming in his weathered eyes. "I thought the fire took that." "It almost did," she said, "but like us it survived." Boone leaned back in his chair, gazing out at the land. The stars were out in full, cold and bright. Coyotes yipped somewhere far off, but the wind carried no threat tonight, only stories. "You know," Boone murmured, "I used to think the land was cursed. After you were gone, I thought maybe we'd built on sacred ground or broke some rule we didn't know." Clara sat beside him, hand in his. "It wasn't cursed, Boone. It was grieving. Same as you." He nodded. "But it's healing now." They sat in silence for a long while, fingers entwined, watching the moon rise over the hills. The ranch still had no cattle, no horses, and no hired hands, but it had roots again, deep ones, grown not from wealth or strength, but from love resurrected. And loss endured. Boone looked over at Clara and smiled. "Reckon we'll build that schoolhouse after all." She grinned back. "Reckon we will." The spring thaw came late to Black Mesa, but when it did, it came like a revelation. Wildflowers pushed through the earth near the fence line. Bees returned to the high grass. The cottonwoods by the dry creek bed began to bud again, branches stretching. Like arms awakening from a long, bitter sleep, Boone stood on the ridge one morning, staring down at the spot where, months ago, he had begun to dig his own grave. The wooden handle of the shovel still jutted from the earth like a marker weather-worn, half swallowed by time. He hadn't touched it since the day Clara returned. Clara joined him silently, a basket of wild herbs on her arm and her shawl tugged tight against the morning wind. She followed his gaze. "You gonna dig that hole or finally fill it in?" Boone smiled faintly. "Thought about turning it into a well." She laughed. "That'd be one way to cheat death, turn your grave into something useful." He looked at her, warmth spreading in his chest like a sunrise. "I was ready to die that day. Truth be told, I'd already died, just hadn't laid down yet." Clara reached out, took his hand, and then I walked over that ridge. He nodded slowly. "I thought I was seeing a ghost." "Maybe you were," she whispered, "but I wasn't there to haunt you. I came back to finish what we started." Boone squeezed her hand, then turned and walked down toward the half-dug grave. He gripped the shovel, worked it free from the earth. The ground was softer now. The frost was gone. He sank the blade deep and began to fill the whole knot in mourning. But in defiance, Clara stood above, watching with tears in her eyes. When the last of the dirt was packed in, Boone drove the shovel into the center like a flag. Then he walked to the nearby cottonwood and carved into its bark with his knife. "Here lies the death that never was." The two stood together in silence, the breeze carrying the smell of sage and life. Back at the ranch, things were changing. Slowly, the Yavapai had returned weeks ago, not in force, but as friends. They helped Boone raise the beams of the new barn, bringing wood and rope and stories from the highlands. In return, Clara treated wounds, traded herbs, and even taught the children to read from the old books she'd kept hidden in a chest beneath the floorboards. A passing cattleman had offered Boone 5 longhorns in exchange for shelter during a storm. Boone took the deal and built a pen. Now the ranch had cattle again, 5 stubborn, thick-necked beasts that Clara insisted on naming after gunfighters and outlaws. On the porch sat a new rocking chair Boone carved himself, side by side with Clara's old one. One afternoon, Boone rode out to check the stream and spotted two boys from the Yavapai village chasing rabbits. Along the dry banks, he tipped his hat. They waved back. Hope was riding the land again. That night, as the sun dipped behind the ridge, Boone and Clara sat side by side watching the horizon. He had a small book in his hands, her journal from the year she'd been gone. She had left it by his bedside one night, quietly. It told the stories of her survival, her suffering, her small joys. Boone closed it gently. "You never stopped writing," he said. "I had to believe someone would read it." He looked at her, eyes soft. "I reckon I'll read it every winter, just to remember how lucky I am." She reached for his hand, wrinkled and strong. "We're not lucky, Boone, we're just stubborn." He chuckled. "Same thing, out here. The land hadn't given up on them. The wind hadn't blown them away. The grave had never been filled, not by Boone, not by death. Instead, it became a turning point, a scar, a symbol. From that moment on, Boone Carver no longer saw the ranch as a place where dreams had died, but as the place where they had been born again.